The morning light filtered through thin blinds, laying faint stripes across the narrow living room where Darius Coleman bent over his notebook. His pencil scratched furiously, shaping lines into columns, columns into rooftops, rooftops into the imagined skyline of city that only existed in his head. The room smelled faintly of coffee and fried eggs, his mother humming gospel in the kitchen, her voice tired but steady. On the couch beside him, his little sister Layla leaned over, chin in her hands, her eyes wide with admiration, as if she were watching him build castles out of thin air. "You're making it look like one of those places on TV," she whispered, pointing at the page. Her small fingers brushed over a crooked drawing of glass windows stacked against a rising tower. "One day it won't just be on paper," Darius said softly, closing his notebook with a half-smile. His shoes squeaked as he stood, worn black sneakers, the rubber soles coming loose at the heel. Layla tilted her head at them with a frown. "You need new ones," she said bluntly, her honesty as sharp as her giggle. Darius bent down and tied the frayed laces tighter, pretending it didn't sting. "These still work. They take me where I need to go." In the kitchen, his mother, Angela, turned from the stove. Her apron was stained with flour, hair wrapped in a faded scarf. She studied her son, her expression a mix of pride and worry. Pride for the young man who carried himself with such quiet dignity, worry for the weight she knew pressed against his back every day. "You've got a long shift tonight," she said, plating the eggs. "Keep your head up, baby. Folks will try you. Just remember what I always said." "Grace," Darius answered before she could finish, his voice warm, practiced. The morning light filtered through thin blinds, laying faint stripes across the narrow living room where Darius Coleman bent over his notebook. His pencil scratched furiously, "Shah, even when they don't deserve it." Angela nodded, though the lines at the corners of her eyes deepened. She placed a plate in front of him, her hands lingering a moment as if reluctant to let him go. He sat and ate quickly, every bite filling him not just with food, but with a reminder of responsibility. His paycheck kept the lights on, paid for Layla's school books, chipped away at rent. On the way out the door, Layla chased him with a small pink backpack in her hands. "Promise me, Darius," she said, eyes wide with that stubborn faith only children carry. "Promise me you'll buy me real sneakers one day. The shiny ones, the ones that light up." He laughed, brushing a hand over her braids. "One day, Lay, and when I do, they'll be the brightest ones in the whole store." Outside, the air carried the faint chill of early autumn, the streets lined with shuttered shops and peeling posters from last month's county fair. The small town was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt like everyone was watching, always measuring. As Darius walked the cracked sidewalk toward the bus stop, the soles of his shoes clapped against the pavement, a rhythm that spoke louder in his mind than it did in the air. Keep moving, keep standing tall, no matter what. On the bus, he sat near the back, notebook in his lap, sketching more outlines of buildings while people climbed aboard. A few nodded politely, others didn't look his way at all. He was used to it. The drawings helped, lines and angles that bent into something better than what surrounded him. By the time the bus hissed to a stop outside the restaurant, the sun was higher, casting the small-town diner in sharp relief. Red and white awnings sagged over clean glass, the smell of frying oil drifting out into the street. It was an ordinary place, nothing special, but for Darius it meant survival. He straightened his tie in the glass door, adjusted his apron, and slipped inside. In that moment, no one looking at him could see the castles in his notebook, the dream's presa. The restaurant hummed with its usual rhythm, plates clattering against the sink, the faint hiss of burgers on the griddle, and a low murmur of conversations that rose and fell like a tide. Darius tied his apron behind his back, smoothed the creases with steady hands, and gave the other waiters a polite nod. Most of them returned it, some with warmth, others with a cool detachment that said, "You're here, but you're not one of us." The manager, Whitmore, emerged from his office at the back. He was a man who wore authority like a badge, tall, broad-shouldered, his white shirt crisp and starched, suspenders cutting across his chest. His thinning blonde hair was slicked back, his face flushed from morning whiskey he thought no one noticed. Whitmore gave the room a glance, his eyes sweeping over the staff, lingering a moment too long on Darius before turning away. "Let's keep things tight today," Whitmore barked, clapping his hands. "We've got a party of executives coming in from a plant. They're the type that expect perfection. Don't give him any reason to complain. We don't want trouble." His gaze flicked toward Darius again, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Yes, sir," Darius said evenly, adjusting his tray. His tone was steady, his face unreadable. He had learned the art of silence. To absorb the sting of comments meant to belittle him and let them dissolve without visible reaction. By noon, the dining room was alive with movement. Families filled the booths, laughter bouncing off the walls. Darius moved between tables with calm efficiency, balancing trays heavy with iced tea and chicken plates. He smiled softly at children coloring on placemats, offered gentle yesers and yeses to older customers. He worked as though he were invisible, present, efficient, but unnoticed beyond the role of service. Then the executives arrived. A group of 6 men in pressed suits, loud voices filling the room before they even sat down. They chose the large round table and tea. Darius nodded, placing menus in front of the men, his voice polite. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. Can I start you off with some drinks?" The men glanced at one another, smirks passing between them. One leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting down to Darius's shoes, the black sneakers dulled with wear, the heel peeling slightly at the back. His lip curled. "Tell me," the man said, voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "are those shoes regulation for waiters? Or are we just letting anybody walk in off the street these days?" Laughter rippled around the table. Another executive chimed in, tapping his fork against his glass. "Looks like those soles are working overtime. Careful, boy. Wouldn't want you slipping and dropping my steak." The word hung in the air, boy, heavy and sharp. A few heads at nearby tables turned, eyes flickering between Darius and the men. Whitmore, standing nearby, chuckled along, shaking his head as though it were all harmless fun. Darius kept his eyes on the notepad in his hand, his grip tight enough to crease the paper. He felt the laughter pressing against his chest like a weight, but his voice came out steady. "We have sweet tea, unsweetened, Coke, and lemonade. What can I get started for you?" The men laughed louder at his composure, like it amused them even more that he refused to flinch. One leaned forward, elbows on the table, lowering his voice, but not enough to be private. "Shoes like that? Son, you ought to be grateful just to be standing here. Don't act like you're on our level." Whitmore smirked, pretending to scold the men, but adding fuel instead. Now, fellas. He's just a kid trying to make ends meet. Don't get his hopes up too high." The words cut deeper than the laughter. Just a kid. Just. As if Darius's worth began and ended with the tray in his hands. He took their orders, writing carefully, his face calm, though his ears burned. Inside, he was measuring every breath, every glance. He could feel the town itself watching him, waiting to see if he would snap, if he would prove every unspoken suspicion about who he was and what he was worth. Instead, he turned, walked toward the kitchen, and let the door swing shut behind him. The clatter of pans and the sizzle of oil greeted him, masking the tightness in his chest. He pressed his hand briefly to his side, breathing slow, steady. Grace, even when they don't deserve it. But the laughter from the dining room still echoed in his ears, a low and constant reminder. The test had only just begun. The dining room was full now, the air thick with chatter, clinking glasses, and the smell of fried chicken drifting over linen-covered tables. Darius moved between the aisles, balancing trays of sweating iced tea pitchers, forcing his focus on the work and not on the echo of laughter that still clung to his skin like smoke. Every step he took in those scuffed sneakers seemed to announce itself against the polished floor, a reminder of what had been said, what had been seen. When he returned to the executives' table, their conversation had swelled with arrogance, the kind of easy dominance that filled space without permission. Whitmore hovered nearby, always eager to impress, nodding and laughing at jokes that didn't warrant laughter. Darius placed the drinks on the table, his movements precise, his hands steady. But one of the men reached out suddenly, tapping his foot against Darius's shoe with exaggerated disgust. "Look at this," the man said loudly, angling his body so that the room could hear. "These things are about to fall apart. Tell me, son, do they pay you in hand-me-downs here, or is this a charity job?" The laughter came quick and sharp as P. Another executive leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Shoes tell you everything you need to know about a man," he declared, as if imparting wisdom. "Cheap shoes, cheap life. No ambition. Just scraping by." Whitmore chuckled, shaking his head in mock disapproval. "Now, don't be too hard on him. Kid's trying. But you're right. You can't walk far in shoes like that." His eyes slid toward Darius, and for a moment, something cruel sparked there. A test, a dare. The room felt suspended, the air too thick to breathe. Darius lowered his gaze, not because he was broken, but because he understood the weight of the moment. One wrong word, one flash of anger, and the story written about him by these men would come true. Angry black boy lashes out. That story had been told too many times in towns like this. He set the last glass on the table, his voice quiet but clear. "Is there anything else I can get for you, gentlemen?" His calm seemed to unsettle them. The laughter faltered, replaced with smirks and sidelong glances. One man muttered under his breath, "Knows his place." Another chuckled, adding, "Bet he shines those at night," praying they last another week. The humiliation was complete, yet Darius gave no sign of breaking. He collected his tray, turned, and walked away with his back straight. But the silence that followed him carried more weight than the laughter. Customers at nearby tables whispered to each other, some shaking their heads, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Near the counter, a teenage busboy stared wide-eyed at Darius, as if waiting for him to explode. But Darius only set the tray down, pressed his palms against the counter, and inhaled slowly. His chest rose, his shoulders squared. His mother's words beat softly in his ears, "Grace, even when they don't deserve it." Whitmore's voice cut through the dining room then, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Don't let it get to you, son," he called out, smirking. "Not everyone's cut out for fine dining. But hey, at least you got a job, right?" That laughter returned, smaller this time, but sharp as glass. In that moment, Darius didn't answer. He didn't have to, because across the room, in the shadowed corner booth, a man was watching, a man who had not laughed once, who had not looked away. His presence was quiet, but his gaze carried weight, and his hand tapped rhythmically against the table as if making a calculation. Darius didn't know yet that the tide was already shifting, that the humiliation meant to break him had instead set something else in motion, something no one in that room was prepared for. The laughter lingered long after Darius disappeared into the kitchen, clinging to the walls like smoke no one could fan away. But in the far corner, away from the clinking silverware and the bright chatter, a man remained motionless, watching. His suit was tailored but not flashy, his beard neatly trimmed, streaks of silver cutting through the black. His presence was the kind that didn't need to be announced. It drew the eye quietly, like the horizon at dusk. Henry Coleman hadn't planned to come here. He'd been passing through the town on his way to a meeting with state officials about a new construction project. Yet something had pulled him into this diner, some old memory of meals taken in places where he was never wanted, a reminder that you couldn't build towers so high they blocked out the ugliness below. He ordered coffee, black, and had been content to sit unseen until he heard the sound of his nephew's voice. At first, he thought it was coincidence. But as the boy turned toward him with that notebook tucked in his apron pocket, the truth settled in. This was Darius, his sister's boy, the nephew he hadn't seen in years, not since family disagreements and pride had BU. When Darius emerged from the kitchen again, tray in hand, his back straight despite the fire in his chest, Henry stood. The scrape of a chair against the floor drew attention. Conversations faltered. Even Whitmore turned, surprised. Henry crossed the room with the measured steps of a man who knew he belonged anywhere he set foot. His voice carried when he spoke, low but commanding. "That's enough." The executives blinked at him, confused. Whitmore gave a short laugh, trying to mask his unease. "Sir, can I help you with something?" Henry ignored him. He stepped beside Darius, resting a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. His touch wasn't possessive but protective, anchoring. His eyes swept the table of suited men. You mock a man for his shoes while you sit fat on food you didn't earn? You laugh at dignity because you've forgotten what it looks like. The room quieted, forks hovering midair, whispers starting in the corners. Whitmore bristled, trying to regain control. Now hold on, mister. This is a private party. You can't just. Henry cut him off with a glance sharp enough to silence. Then he turned back to Darius, his voice softening just slightly. You held yourself with more grace in the last 5 minutes than these men have managed their whole lives. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few diners clapped softly, quickly stifled. The executives shifted in their seats, their arrogance cracking under the sudden weight of scrutiny. One of them muttered, "Who the hell are you?" Henry straightened, his presence filling the space. "Name's Henry Coleman. And this young man you've been ridiculing? He's my nephew." His gaze swept the room again, daring anyone to laugh. "You should remember his name. He'll outlast every one of you." Whitmore's jaw dropped, then clicked shut. He knew the name. Everyone in the county did. Henry Coleman was the contractor who had transformed skylines, the businessman who'd once gone toe-to-toe with developers twice his size and won. His money wasn't just wealth. It was influence, leverage, power that stretched far beyond the walls of this restaurant. The silence that followed was thick, trembling on the edge of transformation. Darius's chest tightened as he looked at his uncle, the man he barely knew, standing like a shield between him and the world's cruelty. For the first time that day, he felt the laughter lift, replaced by something heavier but truer: possibility. Henry leaned closer to Darius, his voice low, meant only for him. "You don't ever let men like that define you. You already showed them what they'll never understand." And with that, the balance in the room shifted. What had begun as a spectacle of humiliation was now something else entirely, a reckoning waiting to unfold. By the next morning, the town was buzzing. What had started as a cruel joke at a single restaurant table had spilled out into streets, living rooms, and cell phone screens. Someone had recorded it, the jeering at Darius's shoes, Whitmore's smirk, and finally, Henry Coleman's steady voice cutting through the noise. The video was shaky, shot from between ketchup bottles, but it carried truth more powerful than any polish could have offered. In less than 12 hours, it was everywhere, shared on neighborhood Facebook groups, whispered about in barbershops, replayed on phones during lunch breaks at the factory. At Angela Coleman's small kitchen table, Layla sat cross-legged, her eyes glued to the tiny screen of her mother's phone. She had already watched it 3 times that morning, wide-eyed, whispering, "That's my brother," each time Henry placed his hand on Darius's shoulder. Angela watched too, her chest tight, torn between pride and fear. She knew what exposure could mean in a town like theirs. Visibility wasn't always protection. Sometimes it was a target. Across town, at the factory's break room, workers crowded around a tablet. Some shook their heads at the executive's laughter, muttering that they weren't surprised. Others leaned forward, nodding when Henry named himself. "That's Coleman," one said, almost reverently. Didn't know the boy was kin to him. The idea spread fast. The poor kid with the busted shoes wasn't just anybody's son. He belonged to a family with power. At the restaurant itself, whispers filled every booth. Some patrons came just to ask staff about what had happened, others to see if they could glimpse the boy who had held his ground. Darius, though, was absent. Whitmore had told him not to bother coming in that day. "Too much attention," he said with a tight smile, but the staff knew better. Whitmore was rattled. By afternoon, the story had grown bigger. A local journalist picked it up, framing it as a tale of small-town cruelty and unexpected justice. A young black waiter mocked for his shoes, the article began, until dignity and family silenced the laughter. The piece spread across regional outlets, and soon larger media caught the scent. Clips were posted with captions like, "Shoes don't define a man," and "Grace under fire." Darius, meanwhile, sat on the front porch of their modest home, the cracked wood steps warm beneath him. He scrolled through his phone in disbelief as messages poured in from classmates, old teachers, even strangers. Proud of you, brother. You handled that with strength. They tried to break you, and you stood tall. But the messages weren't all kind. Mixed among the praise were comments that stung, accusations that he had played the victim, that people are too sensitive these days, that he should have been grateful to have a job at all. They came from faceless accounts, some from people he recognized around town. The world had split along familiar lines, those who saw his dignity and those determined to deny it. Henry arrived in the evening, pulling up in a black sedan that looked out of place on their street of rusting cars and sagging porches. He carried himself like a man unshaken by noise, but his eyes softened when they landed on Darius. "You didn't ask for any of this," Henry said, lowering himself onto the step beside him. "But sometimes life doesn't wait for you to be ready." Darius kept his gaze on the street. "I didn't want anyone to see me like that." His voice was quiet, strained. "Now everyone knows. Not about me, about my shoes, about how they laughed." Henry was silent for a long moment, then said, "What they saw was not humiliation. What they saw was restraint. Power, even when you were cornered. That's what stuck with people. That's why they're talking." Angela joined them then, arms folded, her face lined with both worry and defiance. "Talking's one thing," she said, "but talking won't change how this town works." Henry looked at her, then at Darius, and something flickered in his eyes. Not just protection, but resolve. "Then maybe it's time to make more than talk." From somewhere down the block, the faint sound of a car radio carried through the evening air. A news anchor's voice spoke Darius's name, replaying the story yet again. Inside their house, Layla tugged at her new sneakers. The same worn ones as before, but she looked at them differently now, as if they too carried a story worth telling. The Coleman family had been thrust into the spotlight, whether they wanted it or not. And as the sun dipped below the rooftops, the question hung heavy in the air. What would they do with the weight of this moment? 2 days later, the Coleman living room became something it had never been before, a war room. Angela joined them then, arms folded, her face lined with both worry and defiance. "Talking's one thing," she said, "but talking won't change how this town works." Henry looked at her, then at Darius, and something flickered in his eyes. Not just protection, but resolve. "Then maybe it's time to make more than talk." From somewhere down the block, the faint sound of a car radio carried through the evening air. A news anchor's voice spoke Darius's name, replaying the story yet again. Inside their house, Layla tugged at her new sneakers. The same worn ones as before, but she looked at them differently now, as if they too carried a story worth telling. The Coleman family had been thrust into the spotlight, whether they wanted it or not. And as the sun dipped below the rooftops, the question hung heavy in the air. What would they do with the weight of this moment? 2 days later, the Coleman living room became something it had never been before, a war room. Stacks of papers covered the coffee table, printouts of contracts, employee rosters, and pay stubs smuggled out by sympathetic workers. Angela's kitchen counter doubled as an evidence board, receipts taped against the faded wallpaper, sticky notes mapping connections between Whitmore's businesses. The air buzzed with the kind of tension that precedes a storm. Darius sat on the couch, shoulders tense, scrolling through messages from his coworkers. Stories poured in, stolen tips, unpaid overtime, racist remarks brushed off by management. One worker confessed they had been fired for asking about health benefits. Another described being told to smile more to avoid scaring away customers. It wasn't just one bad night at the restaurant. It was years of quiet exploitation. Henry paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice steady but edged with fire. This isn't about shoes anymore. This is about a system built to keep you small, to make you think you don't have the right to stand tall. Angela crossed her arms. And if we go after them, you know what's coming. Retaliation. Lies. They'll drag our name through the dirt. Henry nodded. Yes, they will. But I've seen worse battles. And I've seen what happens when people fight smart. That was when he revealed the piece none of them knew. His past wasn't just one of wealth, but of strategy. Before investments and corporate boardrooms, Henry Coleman had been an attorney, one who specialized in employment law. Decades ago, He had taken on companies just like Whitmore's, exposing wage theft and discrimination. He hadn't practiced in years, but his instincts were sharp. Darius's eyes widened. "You mean you know how to beat them?" Henry looked at his nephew with a small, grim smile. "I know how to make them show who they really are." The plan began with silence, not confrontation. For a week, they said nothing publicly while gathering evidence. Workers met quietly at Angela's house, sometimes slipping in through the back door, sometimes bringing crumpled receipts, timesheets, or texts from managers. The living room filled with the stories of dishwashers, bussers, single mothers working double shifts. Each story painted a clearer picture. Whitmore's empire wasn't built on brilliance, but on exploitation. Henry called in a few old contacts. A journalist he trusted, a lawyer still practicing, a union organizer who owed him a favor. They began drafting the bones of a case. Meanwhile, Darius used his phone to record conversations discreetly, capturing managers demanding unpaid training hours or mocking black workers behind closed doors. The more evidence they collected, the heavier the air became. It was no longer just about Darius's humiliation. It was about an entire workforce kept in shadows. The counterattack began quietly, then spread like fire. First, a detailed complaint was filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Department of Labor. Henry had made sure every piece of evidence was airtight. Then, almost simultaneously, the journalist published an in-depth exposé, drawing from testimonies of workers who were finally ready to speak on record. The headline cut sharp: "Behind the Kitchen Doors, Exploitation and Racism at Whitmore Dining Group." The effect was immediate. Television trucks appeared outside the restaurant. Workers, once too afraid to speak, began rallying outside with homemade signs. "Fair pay now. Dignity over profits." Angela, once skeptical, stood among them, her voice carrying in chants that echoed down Main Street. Whitmore tried to respond, holding a press conference on the restaurant steps. He smiled too wide, his voice slick with rehearsed charm. "These accusations," he said, "are exaggerated. We treat all employees like family." But as he spoke, someone in the crowd shouted back, "Family doesn't steal our tips." The cameras caught it. The clip spread faster than his excuses. For Darius, the moment of empowerment came not in front of cameras, but in a quiet meeting at the law office Henry had rented for the case. Sitting at a long oak table, he watched as Henry laid out evidence before a team of attorneys, his voice calm but cutting. "This," Henry said, pointing to the payroll records, "is theft. This," gesturing to discriminatory scheduling, "is systemic racism. And this," he tapped the video of Whitmore's mocking laughter, "is the face of arrogance that believed no one would challenge him." The room was silent for a beat. Then one attorney leaned forward and said, "You've got them. This is going to be bigger than just one restaurant." But victory wasn't guaranteed. The Colemans knew the risks. Lawsuits could take years, and Whitmore's allies in town were already whispering threats. Angela's car tires were slashed one night. Darius was followed walking home from school. And yet, instead of retreating, the family grew firmer. In a late-night conversation on the porch, Darius asked Henry, "Why fight so hard? You already made it out. You don't need this." Henry looked at him, the porch light casting deep shadows across his face. "Because I remember what it felt like to be laughed at, to be told you were less. Money didn't erase that. Only justice can." By the end of that week, the tide had shifted. The Coleman family had transformed from targets of humiliation into leaders of a movement. The community, once silent, now had a voice. And Whitmore, once untouchable, was suddenly on the defensive. The stage was set for the showdown, not just in a courtroom, but in the soul of the town itself. The courthouse in Millstone had never seen so many people gather on its steps. By dawn, the line of citizens stretched down the block, a mix of workers in faded uniforms, students carrying handmade posters, and elders who had lived long enough to know this fight was bigger than one restaurant. News vans circled like vultures, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a rare energy. Wooden pews overflowed with townspeople, reporters, and activists who had driven in from neighboring cities. At the front, under the high, echoing ceiling, the judge presided with a stern, watchful expression, trying to contain the rising tension. Darius sat at the plaintiff's table beside his Uncle Henry. His palms were damp, but he held himself upright, refusing to let the nerves show. He scanned the crowd until his eyes landed on his mother in the gallery, her hands folded tight in prayer. She gave him the smallest of nods, the kind only a mother can give, as if to say, "You're not alone." Stand. Across the aisle, Charles Whitmore sat with his legal team, dressed in an immaculate navy suit. His face carried the same smirk Darius remembered from that night, the smug curve of a man who had always believed the town belonged to him. He leaned back casually, as though the whole trial was beneath him, the image of control. But when Henry rose to speak, that illusion began to crack. Henry didn't storm or shout. He spoke with the calm, deliberate cadence of a man who knew that truth, when laid bare, was louder than any raised voice. He began by painting a picture of quiet exploitation. The dishwasher who worked 50 hours but was paid for 35, the single mother forced to clean tables for tips she never received, the teenagers told they were lucky just to have a job, even as their wages disappeared into Whitmore's pocket. The courtroom listened in silence. Pens scratched. Cameras clicked softly. Then Henry revealed the receipts, literal and metaphorical. Payroll records with hours missing. Surveillance footage of managers slipping cash mint for servers into locked drawers. A recording of Whitmore himself joking about keeping the black kids too busy to complain. Each piece hit like a hammer, the sound reverberating through the room as if the walls themselves could no longer contain the truth. Whitmore's attorneys tried to object, to dismiss, to spin. But the judge allowed the evidence, and the crowd in the gallery stirred, whispers swelling into sharp intakes of breath. For the first time, Whitmore's confident posture faltered. His jaw tightened. His fingers drummed against the table, a nervous tell. Then came the moment no one expected. Henry stepped aside and motioned for Darius to take the stand. The room shifted. The boy who had once been mocked for cheap shoes now walked to the witness box, head high, eyes steady. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore his oath, and sat down. His voice shook at first as he recounted the night of his humiliation. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The reporters' pens flew faster. Cameras zoomed in. It was the sound of an empire collapsing in real time, not with an explosion, but with words spoken carelessly by a man who had never imagined he would be held accountable. Henry didn't need to shout. He simply turned to the jury and said, "You heard him." By the time closing arguments ended, the outcome already felt decided. The jury foreman's face was grim. The crowd outside had swelled into the hundreds, chants rising up as if carried by the town itself. And when the verdict was read, guilty of wage theft, guilty of discrimination, guilty of fraud, the courthouse erupted. Applause, shouts, tears. Darius's mother clutched her son as Henry stood quietly behind them, his expression unreadable, but his eyes bright with something like relief. Whitmore sat frozen, his empire crumbling not just in that courtroom, but in the court of public opinion that had witnessed every second. His smirk was gone. On the courthouse steps, with cameras flashing and microphones pushed forward, Henry put a hand on Darius's shoulder and said, "Tell them." And so the young man who had once been mocked for cheap shoes stood before the town and the world, his voice steady, his presence undeniable. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's the beginning. We prove today that no one is too small to be heard, and no one is too powerful to be challenged." The crowd roared. The courthouse shook with chants of justice. And for the first time, Millstone belonged not to Whitmore's empire, but to the people who had found their voice. The weeks that followed the trial carried a kind of quiet electricity through Millstone. For the first time in years, people walked down Main Street with their shoulders lifted, their voices louder, their gazes unflinching. The Whitmore name, once spoken with a mix of reverence and fear, had become a cautionary whisper. His restaurants shuttered, his properties auctioned, and yet, for all the praise, Darius carried the memory of that night with him. The sting of laughter, the way humiliation burned hotter than fire. It lingered, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it reminded him why he had stood up, why he would keep standing. One evening, weeks after the verdict, the Coleman family gathered in Henry's backyard. The air smelled of charcoal and sweet corn roasting, the cicadas buzzing in the heavy dusk. For the first time in months, they weren't planning strategy or reviewing documents. They were just a family, laughing, eating, breathing. Angela leaned back in her chair, watching her son joke with cousins, the light of the fire pit flickering across his face. She turned to Henry. "You saved him," she said softly. Henry shook his head. "No, he saved himself. All I did was remind him what he already carried." Angela's eyes filled, though her smile held. "I almost told him to stay quiet, to let it pass. I didn't want him hurt." "That's how they win," Henry said. His gaze drifted upward to the wide black sky pricked with stars. "They count on us staying silent. But when one person speaks, it's like striking a match. Soon the whole sky's lit." Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Darius lingered in the yard. The fire pit glowed low, embers pulsing faintly in the dark. Henry stepped out with 2 mugs of tea, setting one in front of his nephew. "You know," Henry said, his voice carrying the weight of memory, "when I was your age, I thought justice was something you had to grab with both hands and wrestle down. Took me years to learn that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand still and refuse to move." Darius listened, his eyes fixed on the last flickers of fire. "Do you think it'll last?" "The change." Henry was quiet for a long moment. "Change doesn't last by itself. It has to be lived every day by people who refuse to forget." He glanced at Darius. "That's your work now. Mine too. All of ours.